and I welcome him. Thank you.
Bishop, rector, friends, Peter Rodgers, friend of 40 years standing, thank you all for making this possible. It's very good to be with you, to be with some of you for more than just today, but with all of you here this morning in this lovely church. I had not really tuned in to what this church was, and I've just caught the excitement of a sense of a new project happening here. And it's lovely not just to be speaking briefly in a miscellaneous place, but to be speaking somewhere which seems to be at the cutting edge of a new bit of community, and to have the church at the cutting edge of that new bit of community is a wonderful thing. And rector, wherever you are, can't see, but where's he gone? Where is the rector? Oh, yeah, checking out you really got the instructions right. I was about to say, rector, you're on the cusp, on the leading edge of something going on here. Anyway, will you join me in just a moment of prayer as we think about what I'm going to be talking about? Gracious Father, we thank you for this beautiful place. We thank you for this beautiful day. We thank you for one another and for the privilege of being able to gather, to think, to study, to learn from one another and from you. We pray that we will use these privileges and gifts to your glory in Jesus' name. And the vision that I'm talking about is the vision that Paul had for God's plan and purpose, for what God had already accomplished in Jesus, what God intended to accomplish, and then, as it opens up, for where we belong in the middle of that. You look back to what has happened, you look on to what God will do, and you find your identity and vocation in between those. It's easy for all of us, busy with many proper tasks, whether it's building a church or taking photographs or sorting a sound system. Plenty of people in the church can occupy most of their waking hours just doing the next thing and the next thing to keep the show on the road. But it's easy then to concentrate on these things close to hand and to fail to lift our eyes to the larger picture, which should not only make sense of the details, but also encourage us and stimulate us to live more coherently and consistently within God's new world. And so I want to sketch that larger picture for a few minutes now, and then we can explore the details in questions in whichever way you choose. So one way of summarizing Paul's vision of God's purposes in general and for the church in particular is in the phrase new creation. That phrase itself doesn't occur that often in Paul, but when it does, it is central and vital. At the climax of Galatians, he says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision matters. What matters is new creation. And at the heart of his statement of his own deepest aims and intentions in 2 Corinthians 5, he says, if anyone is in the Messiah, new creation. Most of the translators say there is, or he or she is, but actually Paul just says, if anyone in the Messiah, new creation. The old has gone, the new has arrived. So what did Paul mean by that, and how does that work out in his vision for the church? Again, it's easy for us Western Christians to go for a shrunken vision of what Paul means at this point. For some people, it's simply the individual Christian who is a new creation, sitting next to another person who is also a new creation, and so on. And these new creation people are then, in this view, destined for home in a detached heaven, which has nothing to do with the present creation, the present earth. Now, of course, every single Christian, every one of you, matters specially to God as you are. Though Paul doesn't think of individuals in our sense, and of course we are promised God's glorious future after death. I'm not saying there isn't a great glorious hope beyond. But what matters to Paul is that the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection is this, that in and through Jesus, Israel's Messiah, the Creator's long-planned purpose to rescue and renew his entire creation has already come to pass, and that we are to be caught up within it here and now. So here's how Paul's gospel works in this way. When Jesus died under the weight of the world's sin, he exhausted the power of evil and, in consequence, of death itself, so that God's long-awaited new creation could be born at last. That's what the resurrection is all about. At Easter, it was new creation that emerged from the tomb. not a mere resuscitation of Jesus' dead body as though he'd just come back into the same sort of life as before, but on through death and out the other side into a new immortal physicality. His body was, it seems, transformed. My former colleague Ed Sanders, one of the great New Testament scholars of the last generation, says in one of his books, it looks as though when we read the resurrection narratives, the writers are trying to tell us something which they know happened, but for which they did not have good language. Something new had happened. It had never been thought of like this before. The transformation of old mortal physicality into new immortal physicality. Most of us find it hard to get our minds around, and I think they did as well. And it wasn't just a one-off. The resurrection means what it means because of its relationship to three other things which are themselves very close in ancient Jewish hope and which give shape to these very brief reflections on Paul's vision of the church. First thing, Pharisees like Saul of Tarsus, Paul had been a Pharisee, believed that one day God would raise all the righteous dead to new life. Resurrection was a hope for all God's people at the end. But second, they believed that such people would then share in the new creation which the Old Testament promises. The Psalms and Isaiah regularly talk about God's transformation so that the world will be filled with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. The Creator never planned to abandon his creation. He always intended to rescue it from corruption and decay and to bring it to the rich fulfillment that he'd planned and promised. And third, then, this would always involve humans as God's agents. The royal priesthood bringing God's loving care into the world and presenting the world's praises back to the Creator. That is the large vision shared by many Jews of Paul's day. You can find exceptions, you always can. But that's a broadly Jewish first century view. The resurrection of all God's people, the renewal of creation, and the renewal of human beings to be God's agents in the world and the praise carriers, if you like, reflecting creation's praises back to God. So what happens? When Jesus himself was raised from the dead, all by himself, as it were, within the middle of history, Paul came to believe, and it's Paul's insights that then drove so much of the early church teaching. Paul came to believe that with this totally unexpected event, these three things had come rushing forward into the middle of history. Think for a moment about what that means. First, in rising from the dead, Jesus encapsulated in himself God's vision for all God's people. God did for Jesus, close up and personal, what he'd promised to do for all Israel. And the purpose of God's people is therefore embodied in him personally. And that's why Paul speaks of Jesus' followers as being in the Messiah, in Christ. So that what is true of him is true of them also. It's happened in him. And if you want to be part of it, you have to be in him. So that's the first reason why Jesus' resurrection means what it means for us. If we are in him, we are part of the people of God already, in principle, renewed. That's what baptism is all about, dying and rising in him. Second, then, the risen body of Jesus forms the beginning of the actual new creation. That little, small, localized part of creation, which was Jesus' body nailed to the cross, has been transformed so that a little bit of new creation already exists, even in the midst of the old world that is full of corruption and decay. New creation has already begun. And if we belong to Jesus, we are not only to benefit from that, but actually to be agents of new creation here and now. We're not just passive recipients, we are called to be. You can see this in the resurrection narratives. Often when clergy preach on Easter Day, yet again, how am I going to say something new on Easter? It tends in many churches to fall down into Jesus is raised, therefore there is a life after death, therefore we can share that life after death, and isn't that wonderful? That's not what Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John say. They all basically say in their resurrection narratives, Jesus is raised, therefore he really is the Messiah, therefore new creation has actually begun, and therefore we have a job to do. more or less. And that's why you then need the Spirit to enable you to do that job. Because, thirdly, in Jesus, the divine vision for renewed humanity has already been born, and the good news summons us to share in that reality. We are to be part of the plan for how creation is to be restored. We are called to live as the royal priesthood, sharing both halves of Jesus' role and work, royal and priestly. This is a painful calling. Paul speaks of suffering with him so that we may be glorified with him. But that's what it means to be part of new creation while the old, corrupt and deadly creation still grinds on all around us. We are to be signs of contradiction, and often we get caught in the gap, and it hurts. And that's part of the deal. So, this vision of new creation happening all at once in one small spot but with cosmic significance, encapsulating the Creator's purpose for the whole world, focused on the royal priesthood. In first century Jewish terms, this is a temple vision. As we know from Jewish writers contemporary with Paul, many in his day understood the Jerusalem temple to be the microcosmos, the little world, symbolizing in its structure and its decoration the whole of creation. We do a bit of that in churches, don't we? We symbolize and embody and represent different aspects of our story, not just to remind us of it, but to do something about sacred space, which we're not very good at articulating, but you sort of intuit when you come into a place like this. This is a place of prayer, not away from the world, but for the world. The temple wasn't a retreat away from the world into a small private religious space. It was the divine bridgehead into the world, the place where the Creator had established his throne, on earth as in heaven, in order eventually to do for the whole world what he was doing for the temple, which was to fill it with his glorious presence. So the temple was, in other words, the place where heaven and earth came together. When you went to the temple, if you were a first century Jew, it wasn't as if you were in heaven. You were right there, because the two spheres, I can't draw it with my hands in the air, but you see what I'm saying, the two spheres intersected at that point. Paul believed that that had come true in Jesus, and still more remarkably perhaps, that it was coming true through the Spirit in God's people. One of the things that I stumbled upon, which had never occurred to me in this way before, when I wrote my little commentary on Acts in my Everyone series, was that in Acts chapter 1, with the ascension of Jesus, what you have is a little bit of earth now in heaven, i.e. the body of Jesus. And if you think it's impossible to have a bit of earth in heaven, then you need to imagine a different conceptuality, a different cosmology. Heaven and earth are made for one another, not to be made split off from one another. So you have a little bit of the earth creation renewed and now able to be a place where heaven and earth meet. And then in Acts 2, the Pentecost scene, you have the breath of heaven coming to indwell people on earth. This is all about temple language, which is why in Acts some of the main controversies and points of tension and indeed violence take place in and around and to do with temples, both Jerusalem and elsewhere. Now, this theme goes right back to the books of Genesis and Exodus. In Genesis 1 and 2, the creation of the world is described in terms appropriate for the construction of a temple. Old Testament scholars have been making this point for a while now, that the bifurcated heaven and earth reality is what the Creator makes, intending it to be his home. And this home has a place for us as well. When you build a temple, the final thing you put into it is an image of the God, so that worshippers can see who they're worshipping, and so that the power and influence of the God may be present in their midst and all around. That's the role marked out for the image bearers, that is, the human beings, men and women in the image of God. But then, after many disasters and after the launching of the divine rescue operation through the call of Abraham, God then rescues his people from slavery in Egypt, and then, despite their idolatry, he gives them the tabernacle. His glorious presence comes to dwell there, to guide them to their inheritance. And the end of the book of Exodus corresponds to the beginning of Genesis, perhaps with Aaron and his sons symbolizing the new humans, the image bearers. If we hold that narrative in our heads and hearts, the Creator God rescuing the slaves and coming to dwell in their midst, then we have a clear signpost to what Paul means when he speaks of new creation and new temple. And this is often missed because we Westerners have forgotten the significance of the temple. But once we see that story, the focus of creation and covenant, we see that when Paul uses temple language about Jesus and about the Spirit, he intends this in all its richness. And the result, I suggest to you this morning, is a new vision of the church for Paul's day and for ours. What it requires, of course, is a strong theology of the Holy Spirit, which is exactly what Paul supplies. Again and again, when he speaks of the indwelling of the Spirit, we should hear that language in terms of the divine glory indwelling the wilderness tabernacle, the temple in Jerusalem, in both cases doing so as an advance foretaste and promise that one day the divine glory will fill the whole of creation. What God has done in Jesus uniquely, God will do for the whole creation, and in between, he does it in and for us. That's how it works. So, what happens when we put these two together? New creation, new temple. Paul's aim all through is to grow communities around the world which are a kind of dispersed temple, and hence a sign of that intended new creation. It's lovely to be saying this in a church built here for this reason, to be a sign of God's presence in a growing, new, burgeoning community. That's wonderful. And this, he says in Colossians 1, is the mystery. The Messiah in you, the hope of glory. May it be so here and all over the place. He doesn't mean that in an individualistic sense. He means, I think, that the indwelling of the Messiah in these little communities is the sign that God's purpose for the temple is starting to be fulfilled. The hope of glory in the Psalms and Isaiah was that the glorious divine presence which filled the temple would one day flood the whole creation. And the church is to be the sign and foretaste of that happening. Of course, not just buildings, much more the actual people doing the stuff out there in the community, but the building symbolizes it as well. Now, shimmering across Israel's scriptures was the hope that the nations of the world would come flooding into Jerusalem to worship the one God. You get it in Micah 4, you get it in Isaiah 2, you get it in the Psalms, Zechariah, and so on. Paul believed that in Jesus, and now by the Spirit, that direction had been reversed. The temple had itself gone out into all the world. And he echoes the language of the relevant passages in Genesis and Exodus. You see it in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, which picks up the story from the end of the book of Exodus of how after the sin of the golden calf, the glorious divine presence nevertheless comes to dwell in the tabernacle. And Paul takes the theme of glory all the way back to an echo of Genesis 1. He says this glory promise is fulfilled because the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," Genesis 1, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus the Messiah. And the result is that Paul, as the apostolic bearer of this mystery, shares in the messianic vocation, suffering and reconciliation. 2 Corinthians 4 and 6 are full of the strange cross-shaped suffering which Paul must undergo. But held in place between them, we have 2 Corinthians 5, which focuses on the church as new creation, and then overflows in all directions in terms of Paul's ministry of reconciliation. This is indeed temple language. The love of God, unveiled in the death of the Messiah, draws people from every background into the single family, into the place where the glory is revealed. And the church's task is to live by that vision and bring it into reality through the costly message of reconciliation. So if this is where and how heaven and earth are to come together in anticipation of the final day when they will do so fully and forever, then Paul naturally sees the church as the place where reconciliation of all sorts has to take place. Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female. That's just for a start. These are vital elements and signposts to the larger picture. This takes pastoral skill to work out. And in several of Paul's letters, we see that pastoral skill at work. Paul believes that the church is to live as a new kind of community, a community in which the only marker that matters is the pistis Christou, the faithfulness of the Messiah, and then the people's faithfulness in the God who raised Jesus from the dead. That's the one thing which marks us out. When I was practicing as a bishop in Durham, I did what bishops do. You go around and take confirmation services. And because many of the people who come to confirmation services to support their families and friends are not regular church attenders, I would often do a little sotto voce running commentary on the service, because otherwise some of it would seem rather peculiar. And when it got to the creed, I would say, we say this creed because when we are baptizing or confirming these people, the only mark that this is the Christian church is not whether you're tall or short or fat or thin or rich or poor or black or white or male or female or whatever. It is simply that we believe in the God who we know as Father, Son, and Spirit. It's the only thing that marks us out. And that liturgical act comes straight out of Paul's theology of justification. Of course, faith then works itself out in 1,000 different ways. If it's the faith which is in Jesus, the crucified and risen one, then you can't just say, oh yeah, I sort of believe that, that's fine, and then go on living the same way. No, that is a radical transformative thing. And for Paul, the unity and the holiness and the suffering of the community are all part of this. But it isn't simply about the church's internal life. It's about the church as the sign of reconciliation across all other areas of life. It's about first the church as the new kind of community. A lot has been written in recent years about Paul's vision of Jesus as Lord over against Caesar as Lord. That is broadly correct. The trouble is that we translate it all too easily into our own low-grade modern political polarizations, whether of left or right or some others. And that doesn't really catch the point. The point for Paul is that if it is truly Jesus who is Lord, then lordship itself means something radically different from what it does everywhere else. For Paul, as for Mark or John, the sovereign Jesus is the crucified Jesus. Paul is echoing Psalm 2, Jesus' lordship over the world, but he speaks simultaneously of his suffering. The messianic rule is the rule of sovereign love. The messianic community must therefore also be a community characterized by love, not in our shallow modern Western sense of an anything goes tolerance. Oh, yes, I love you so you can do what you like. No. That would allow the world's corruption to infect the church once again. That's happened all too often in the past. Rather, in the sense of the redemptive love that does for humans and the world what God did for Israel at the Exodus, rescuing people from slavery of all sorts. There are ways of being human which are actually forms of slavery. And even though we will be tempted, like the wilderness generation, to go back to Egypt, they had better food there than all this manna they had to eat for 40 years in the wilderness, we have to resist that siren call. The church is then a new political entity in that it is called to model the new way of being human in a world which doesn't want to know about that sort of thing. Of course, Paul doesn't envisage his churches being major players on anybody's political stage. Imagine you've got 20 Christians in a city of 50,000, perhaps 50 in a city of 1 million. It's not an option. But he does envisage them modeling this new way of being human, not least precisely in reconciliation. Being reconciled to God, they are to be reconciled to one another. And this theme, the reconciled unity of the church across traditional barriers, is a major theme throughout Paul's letters, worked out in many, many different practical and pastoral ways and situations, emphasized with vigor. He talks to the Philippians about being of one mind and one soul and one heart and in full accord and sharing the same love and the same sympathy. He can't think of enough ways to say it, because he knew, as all of us do in the church, that it's actually not easy. You have to keep that goal constantly before you, and every day you have to work at it. By the same token, he insists on holiness, on a renewed Jewish, that is, a new creational kind. God's purposes for the world and for humans as his image bearers have been relaunched through the messianic events and put into operation through the Spirit. Okay, so just as the Jerusalem temple is the holiest spot on the face of the earth for a Jew, it's where heaven and earth meet, so the church is to be the place where heaven and earth meet, leaving behind everything that speaks of death and decay and destruction, coming alive in the Spirit to love and joy and peace and all the rest. And this is at the heart of Paul's vision of Christian life. His vision is not so much of a new religion as a new kind of religion, breaking the molds of what that slippery word religion has meant in the first century and also in our day. For them, religion was something that bound communities together, bound people and their gods together. Well, the difference being that the gods were immortal and invisible and very powerful, but they were part of the community. But for Paul, the one true God had come to be part of Israel and the world once and for all, visibly, attaining his immortal physicality through shameful death, and now exercising the radical power of love. So that the notion of holiness, of being special, of a different way of being human, was one way in which Israelite religion was different from ancient paganism. And here Paul emphatically goes with the Jewish tradition. If the glorious divine presence has come to dwell in you, in your hearts and in your midst, then the positive holiness of genuine humanness is your true vocation. And here too, he says the church is to shine like a light in a dark world. It's a different way to be human, and people quickly noticed. There's a wonderful line in the doctor Galen, who's a famous pagan doctor at the end of the 2nd century in Turkey, and known in Rome and so on. One of the great doctors in the medical tradition. Galen had heard of the Christians. He didn't know much about them, but he'd only heard of 2 things about them, and both of them made him think that they were mad, but he respected them because they really stuck to what they believed. The first was they believed in the resurrection of the body. The second was that they didn't sleep around. He thought on both counts, they must be crazy. Nobody else lives like this. But wouldn't it be nice if the church today were known for its belief in the resurrection and in sexual morality? Sadly, that's not going to happen just tomorrow, but it's a warning shot across the bows that actually there is a way of being human which honors the body and which therefore reflects the good intentions of the Creator. Anyway, another feature of temple theology is that in some Jewish traditions at least, the divine presence in the temple takes the form of wisdom. This is another way of bringing together creation and temple. That's actually a bit of a step off to one side at the moment. I'm going to leave that little bit out because I'm nearly done and we need to move on to the next section. But putting it all together, I see a remarkable and challenging picture. In politics, in religion, in philosophy, Paul's vision of the church, centered on new creation and new temple, is not about retreat from the world, but modeling a new way of being in the created order, being human, being God's people. At every point, God through the church is saying yes to the world, but that yes is shaped by the Messiah's death and resurrection. New creation emerges from the tomb. It isn't simply the old creation topped up or cleaned up a bit here and there. And every generation has to live with this challenge. The challenge of a new creation which affirms all that is good and God-given about the world. The challenge of a new creation which overlaps with the present creation uncomfortably rather than retreating from it into a safe, private world, and yet which must not allow the world to set its agendas. Paul says, whatever is true and lovely and good report, anything virtuous, anything praiseworthy, so much of which you'll find out there in the wider world. Think about these things. But at the same time, he says in the very next verse, and here's what you should do, what you have learned and received and heard in me. There's the balance that the church has always found it hard to keep. Celebrate all that is good in the whole wonderful wide world. Behave in accordance with the apostolic vocation. And then he says, the God of peace will be with you. God with us is a temple image. The divine glorious presence will come to dwell. The God of peace, the reconciling God. That was the focus of Paul's vision of the church. Please God, may it be ours as well. There, that was all that I was going to say to you. We move into our time of questions. And Peter is going to come up here, and we're going to move back a bit and sit there, and Peter is going to...
As you know, I work in 1 Peter, so I'm especially interested in that. I'd like you actually to say more about that, and particularly in relation to the new way of being human. And perhaps if I push that one step further, that's to take us well into the rest of the hour, what that means in terms of the man and woman as created as God's image in the garden, and the restoration of that image, and maybe what Paul has to say about that.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, of course, and when we go back to Genesis 1, as I think we all need to do again and again, because it's one of those passages which is so deep and rich, and there's a sense in which we all know it rather well, and there's another sense in which we all just skim the surface. But what I see in Genesis 1, trying to read it with Pauline eyes, or indeed Johannine eyes, or maybe even Petrine eyes, what I see in Genesis 1 is this layer after layer after layer of complementarities, that heaven and earth are not made to be separate, they're made to be joined together. It is we who pull them apart. And then in Genesis 1, there's the sea and the dry land, and there's the plants and the animals, and gradually the bifurcation of creation, the complementary bifurcation with the plant kingdom already, and also with the animal kingdom, and then specifically with the human kingdom, is male and female. And that's partly because in the purpose of God for creation, it seems to me, God, in making humans his image bearers, is doing something which says, humans, you have a place not just as walk-on parts in my drama, but actually the people who are taking my drama forward. Be fruitful and multiply, and look after the earth and make it fruitful and bring forth fruit, and look after the garden and name the animals. And so the fruitfulness aspect, which is the result of the complementarity, which, as I say, is plants and animals as well as humans, is about being image bearers, taking forward the divine purpose. And so this is why the horrible thing that happens in Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel, one son murdering the other, it's a kind of a threat to the whole thing, that humans are not supposed to be like that. And so when God then calls Abraham in Genesis 12 and says, I will make you fruitful and I will multiply you, and in you and your seed all the families of the earth will be blessed. Paul picks this up in Romans 4 when he talks about Abraham's faith and the fruitfulness which results from that, which somehow reverses symbolically what has been falling apart. Now, of course, this is a very broad brush thing, and already in the Old Testament we can see all kinds of wrinkles and new ways of looking at this or that, and Abraham and Sarah get muddled, and there's the Isaac and Ishmael problem, and Jacob has a pretty torrid time of it, and so on. So we're not talking about, okay, they just got it together and it was all sweetness and light thereafter. Certainly not. But in the New Testament, what we find again and again is we're called to be people of the new Genesis 1. And Jesus says that in Mark 10, and Paul emphasizes it again and again, being transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove and put into practice what God's will is. And this is a new creation thing. So then the temple theme in the middle of that, echoing Genesis, is God's establishment of a place where his own presence dwells in the middle of this creation as the sign and the means whereby this can happen. And it seems to me this then transmutes through the person of Jesus himself into the vocation of the church, to be the place where, and it's always difficult and it's always involves suffering and tension and problems and arguments and difficulties, nevertheless, through the cracked vessels, as he says in 2 Corinthians 4, the glory shines through, that there is a new way to be human. And even though it's difficult and we struggle for it and it involves suffering and contradiction and so on, that's what we keep coming back to. There's a kind of a dogged, gritty return to the center again and again in the New Testament. Is this?
Yes, Tom, that's just getting at it. It was so explosive in terms of my own thinking, but in particular, 3 times in this talk, you used the expression a royal priesthood. I want to point out to you that you've robbed from Peter to pay Paul.
Of course, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
I've been waiting for weeks to say that to him.
That's great, and I shall. Thank you. It's one of those. I shall quote you on that. That's really good. I really like that.
But this whole idea of the kingly and priestly function of the man and the woman who are the image of God in creation, that really got me going.
In Paul, you see the royal bit when he talks about God's people as sharing the Messiah's reign. He says in Romans 5, those who receive the gift of righteousness will reign in life. The Greek is basileusousin, which is a royal word, a kingly word. And I think we in the Western Church have actually forgotten what that means. In the Eastern Church, when they do weddings, they put crowns on the head of the bride and groom as a sign that they are, in this marriage, they are royal. They are sharing the royal rule of God in the world. This is how it works. And of course it's honored in the breach as much as the observance, but that's what the symbolism is supposed to mean. And then Paul balances that when he talks in priestly language about Christians in general presenting their bodies as a living sacrifice, and then he talks about his own mission in Romans 15 as presenting to God the offering of the Gentiles as he comes to Jerusalem with the collection that he's taken from the Gentile churches. So he is constantly using priestly language for both the human vocation and for his own apostolic vocation. And so the phrase royal priesthood, obviously Exodus 19, 1 Peter, Revelation, and Paul is kind of waving at the phrase as it goes by and expounding it in other ways, but that's nice,
Yes. Having said that and got that picture in our mind, I'd like to push you a little further in terms of our vocation then in being royal priesthood, in declaring the new life begun, the new creation inaugurated in Jesus' resurrection. Our common friend and former mentor, Stephen Neal, used to say, when Jesus rose from the dead, the universe became a new place. He says, of course, the newness is breaking in unevenly.
Yes.
And in terms of our vocation, to be those agents through whom that might break in, you know, where the rubber hits the road, where you have serious unemployment, in places like where you served in Durham and so on. Or, you know, if you go to see a prisoner who is in prison for a felony, that felony will follow him or her where she goes. How can we proclaim the resurrection, new life, renewal, new creation to those folks?
One of the challenges of my ministry in Durham was my regular visits to the prison. Durham Prison is a very poignant place. It's down by the river at the sort of bottom of the town, and from the prison yard you can see steeply up on the hill, Durham Cathedral, this beautiful, wonderful, great Norman building. And by the same token, if you know where to look from the tower of Durham Cathedral, you can see the prison down there. And I used to remind them of that we're actually part of the same community, even though it doesn't feel like that, even though very few people from the one actually go to the other and vice versa. And I used to remind prisoners when I would go and take services and preach that actually some of the most significant writings in the New Testament are written from prison. You know, some of Paul's key letters. Imagine not having Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. You know, the wealth of insight that comes from a man who's in chains. Now, of course, we would say Paul was in prison unjustly, etc. Well, as far as the Romans were concerned, that was where he needed to be because he was a dangerous guy. And we're not quite sure what got him into those particular prisons at that time, but that's how it was. So in the New Testament itself, you have this kind of a crossover of new life breaking in, but it's very contested. And some of the most visionary statements, like in Colossians, when he says that Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, and in him all things were created, all powers and authorities and rulers and dominions. All things were created in him and for him. And the gospel has already been announced to every creature under heaven. And who is writing this? Some guy in a jail, probably in Ephesus, with friends bringing him food because they didn't feed him. You know, there's that lovely crossover, and I think Paul actually rather relished that because it is the shape of the cross etched into our world. And I was aware as I was doing the short talk that I couldn't nuance everything, but I was worried about the danger of giving the impression that you might hear me saying, this stuff is happening and we have the Holy Spirit, so we can just go and make the world a different place, just like that. Now, we can and we will, but it'll cost. And it'll cost in nasty ways, because when you try to take the kingdom of God into areas where people are, in Paul's language, worshipping other gods, then battle will be joined, strange things will happen, and you will only find the way through by prayer and fasting, by the serious attention in the sacramental life of the church, in the study of Scripture, and above all in prayer and shared prayer and mutual ministry. And so, the New Testament is full of all of that, but we can easily discount it. On a sunny day in our nice Western world, we think, yeah, that's right, we're God's people, we're doing new creation, let's get on with it. Now, I suspect you all know in your personal lives and in your church lives that it is never that easy. And sometimes it seems to be 3 steps forward and 4 steps back. But actually, again and again, those 3 steps forward may actually be the bridgehead into something quite new. It's what one of our British sociologists of religion calls cascading grace, that God starts, it seems, with just a little thing which happens. And we think, oh, well, it's only just some odd idea that somebody's had. But then somebody else sees that and thinks, hey, we could do that in our parish. Or, well, wait a minute, if we're doing that, why don't we just have a word with so-and-so and see if we could also do this? And before you know what's happened, something which starts, Jesus said it, as a grain of mustard seed, grows into a whole plant to God's glory. And it's always costly, it's always contested, it's always painful. And at the end, all we can say is, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. We none of us get to the point where, yeah, I'm doing royal priesthood, isn't that great? When you put on a bishop's hat and all the kit and so on and parade down a cathedral, you know in your heart of hearts that you too are a sinner saved by grace alone. Nevertheless, God gives you these roles, gives all of us these roles, which we fulfill tremblingly.
Yeah, that is, again, a visionary way of looking at it. You touched on some ways, especially in your visit to the prison. Yeah. How can our little parishes, some of them really little, be signs and signposts of that new creation breaking in? You gave us some examples in the last few days of things that you had seen going on in your diocese and heard about across denominational lines. You might share some of those.
Yes, I mean, of course, there are many people in the world who wouldn't name the name of Jesus or perhaps any other of the world's great religious leaders or whatever you want to say, who nevertheless do good to their neighbors. And one of the interesting things about Christian history is that in the ancient world, basically people didn't do that. The ancient world was a very much dog-eat-dog, everyone for themselves world, where some of the philosophers might see that you might have some obligations to poor people in your area, but this was always done in a patronizing spirit and rather sort of looking down your nose at these people who I suppose I have to help them, whatever. The Christians, following the Jews, didn't do this. The early Christians helped, healed, educated people other than their own, to the extent that sometimes when there would be a plague or whatever, the Christians would stay and nurse people who were sick while the doctors would get out of town fast in case they caught the plague. And so some of the Christians would die and some of them wouldn't. And people would, what was this all about? Nobody has ever imagined living like this before. And they would say, well, it's because we follow this man called Jesus. And so it seems to me every church in its locality if people are praying and are keeping their eyes and ears open, every church will be aware of things that are going on in which people are being diminished and dehumanized. You know, a care home that's being badly run where old people are not being properly looked after, or a prison it might be where visitors are coming but there's nowhere for them to meet and gather before they're allowed in. In my diocese, the visitor centers at the prisons were staffed, I think, about 95% with volunteers from local churches. And okay, there may be other people who volunteer to do that as well. That's fine. This isn't an exclusive thing. The whole point is that it's whatever is good and laudable, and let's celebrate it and get with it. But actually, people have done studies in my country, I don't know if it's the same in yours, that in terms of volunteering in society to do the things which actually make the world a more humane place, the high proportion of those people are regular churchgoers in the UK. And people have pointed out if all the churchgoers withdrew all their voluntary service, then the government would be really in a mess, because there'd be all sorts of things that should be happening in society, which we all know should be. But this is a measure of the impact that the church has had on society, but each generation we have to renew and refresh that. I mean, I remember it's at one level it's so trivial, and you might say it's just a sort of silly little thing round the corner. But I remember going to a Mothers' Union meeting in a little parish outside Durham in an old mining village, and just talking to these dear ladies of a certain age, and their project at that time was making dolls and teddy bears to take into the sick children's hospital down the road, because a lot of the kids who came in hadn't brought any toys with them, quite possibly didn't possess any toys. And I just thought, a tiny little vignette just to make life a little bit less unbearable and to be a sign of hope. And why were they doing it? Because they are followers of Jesus. And that's a tiny thing. And you might say, well, making teddy bears, anybody can do that. Yes, they can. Good, fine. But it just happened to be again and again the followers of Jesus who were doing it. And then on the much larger scale, of course, in my country, and I don't know where you guys are with this, but we've had a huge push over the years about third world debt, about the fact that half the world, or a third of the world, is in huge unpayable debt to financial institutions in the first world. And that as a result, many sub-Saharan African countries, many places like the Philippines, are having to grow the wrong sort of crops in order to sell them, in order to pay off the compound interest on these debts which were run up 50 years ago by unscrupulous rulers who are now long since dead and gone, or possibly living in Switzerland or somewhere. And in my country, it is the churches that have held the government's feet to the fire on this issue. It's the churches who have organized marches and done rings round the G8 summit and said, we're going to sing hymns and we're going to say prayers and we're going to say, we are concerned for the poor and you should be concerned for the poor. And such change as has come, e.g. Tanzanian world debt was remitted, with enormous humanizing change for that whole country. That has come through the pressure of churches. So whether it's making a few teddy bears for the local...
We want that you're here because we want to hear you. You mentioned the book, The Clergy Conference, and I've read it as well, Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity, which demonstrated how early Christians were noticed. You mentioned it in the caring for those...
This is the funny thing. When we studied patristics, i.e. the early church, and the teachings of the great fathers like Irenaeus and Tertullian and Cyprian and Augustine and so on, I somehow had the impression at the age of 22, 23, that Christianity spread by great ideas being passed from one great brain to another great brain. And the truth, my friends, is no, that's not how Christianity spreads. The ideas being developed are the backbone, or the scaffolding, if you like. You've got to have that stuff, otherwise you're at the mercy of whichever ideology comes blowing on the next wind. But the reason people become Christians is not usually because they've been convinced about some clever doctrine of the Trinity, but because some people down the street are behaving in a Jesus-shaped fashion. And they say, oh my goodness, didn't know you could be like that. I really rather like the feel of this. What does it take to join in? That's how it happens.
Yeah, and particularly it's in Stark's chapter on the way in which women were welcomed and affirmed. Would you say something about that?
Absolutely. This book, Rodney Stark, S-T-A-R-K, he's a sociologist who teaches now at Baylor University in Texas. And this is perhaps his most famous book, though he's written several, The Rise of Christianity. He has a whole chapter on the place of women in the early church, which is really interesting because many of us grew up with the rhetoric of the modern women's movement, which is that the early church was basically patriarchal, was anti-women, kept women down, and it's only in the last generation that they finally...
people say that about Paul even now.
People say it about Paul even now, though it's manifestly, demonstrably untrue in Paul.
I mean, we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that. Don't lose that, yes. But you see, in the ancient pagan world, most people didn't want daughters, or not very much. Having got 2 daughters and 2 sons, I resonate with a friend from Princeton who said to me, every time I hear the word daughter, I feel a hand reaching for my wallet. And, my older daughter last year sent me a Father's Day card, which was a picture of a hand holding a sheaf of 20-pound notes. And it said, Dad recognized the stuff. He remembered having some before his daughters arrived. my daughter sent me this card with a kind of a wry, thanks, Dad. Yeah, that's how it is. So, I mean, we can joke about it. But in the ancient world, you might have one daughter and you might bring her up. But if you had a second daughter, the chances are you would quite literally throw her out.
Yeah, you know that famous papyrus, 744 at Oxyrhynchus, written the year that Jesus was born, or around then.
That's right, which is a letter home by a soldier, I think, or a traveller.
By a businessman in Alexandria, written to Oxyrhynchus, and he's writing his wife, probably, who's about to have a baby.
Wife, and he said, if it's a son, keep it, but if it's a daughter, throw it out. Yeah. And that's just how they did it. Result, there were far fewer women in pagan circles than there were in Christian circles, because the Christians followed the Jewish line. Again, the Jewish ethic of how you treat humans and human bodies comes straight through into the church, that these people are in the image of God, and you do not do this. So abortion and infanticide were outlawed in Judaism and early Christianity, whereas the pagans practiced them both. And so a lot of women died when they were being forced to have an abortion. Often husbands forced wives to have don't want any more children. You have the abortion, and the woman might die. And if it was a girl being born, they would throw it out anyway, leave it for the wolves or the gypsies or whatever. So there were a lot more Christian women around, and those Christian women would often marry pagan men because there weren't enough pagan women to go round, and they would bring up the children as Christians. And that's one of the ways in which Christianity spread. And the honoring of women is remarkable in the early church when you compare it with its whole surrounding pagan culture.
Can you then just say a little something about the assumptions that are often made about Paul and some of the things he's written and so forth?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Paul has been clearly, bits of Paul have been picked up and used in pretty devastatingly bad ways. I mean, we all know that, what's the phrase, a text without a context is a pretext, or whatever. It's the sort of thing that teachers like Peter and me like to say to students to keep them on their toes. But if you just pick up, say, 1 Corinthians 11 about women's headgear, or 1 Corinthians 14, there's a little snippet at the end about women keeping silent in the church, or 1 Timothy 2, which is a very contested and difficult passage with some odd words that don't occur anywhere else in the New Testament, then you might get the impression that Paul simply thinks women are second-class citizens or worse, which is, of course, what Aristotle thought, and that they should be kept down, should be kept in their place. And then you look and see what Paul actually does. When Paul writes one of the most extraordinary pieces of literature in all of world history, called the Letter to the Romans, which he must have known. When you write something like that, you must know that you've actually composed a masterpiece. It's impossible to write a letter like Romans and not know that you've done something truly dramatic. Who does he give it to take to Rome? Somebody called Phoebe, who is a deaconess in the church in Cenchreae, just the eastern port of Corinth, and she's a businesswoman, and she's on her way to Rome, and he gives it to her to take. Who is the first person who reads the letter to the Romans out in public? Pretty certainly Phoebe, because often the messenger would read the letter. Who is the first person who expounds the letter to the Romans? Probably Phoebe, because after the first reading, people would say, what did he mean by this bit? And the person they would want to ask would be the messenger. And then when you run through the rest of Romans 16 and see the place that women have, that Paul is greeting
Priscilla,
them,
for instance.
Priscilla, but also Junia, who he
yeah.
describes as an apostle, and again, it's not a list of men with one or two women as appendages. It's a list of men and women, and some of them seem to be married couples, and some of them are simply these women and those men and so on, and they're his fellow workers, they're his fellow servants. Some of them have risked their necks on his behalf. And again, when you put this in the context of, say, Cicero's letters or Seneca's letters or any other great writers from the ancient world, this is truly explosive and extraordinary. No. And it's among the reasons in the New Testament why we actually have to rethink then the way we read the apparently difficult passages.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is one. I think that it's time for questions from all of you. I've enjoyed this conversation. We'll keep going for another years.
Another 40 years.
Yes, right, that's right, I think so. But Rob has a mic there, and if you raise your hand with a question, he'll find you.
There's two over there already.
Both sides equally honored, both men and women equally honored, all the rest of it.
So we'll come over here to your left, gentlemen.
Bishop Wright, thank you for being here again. When we see Acts 19, Paul's engagement with Ephesus, what would a modern engagement with a city like San Francisco look like for Paul?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in Ephesus, what happens is that a local group of manufacturers grumble because they think their business is going to be undone, because if Paul's message gets out, namely that idols have no real existence, then the people who manufacture little silver models of Diana of Ephesus, they're going to be out of business. And so they then raise a religious storm because they say he's a Jew, etc. It's quite like what happens in Philippi when the people who are looking after the slave girl, when Paul exorcises her, they've lost their business, so they bring a religious and a civic charge. And so all these levels are swirling together. And it's a sense that you never know which way it's going to work out. If you're doing the Jesus stuff, then sooner or later, somebody is going to say, you're treading on my toes here. I don't like this. We don't want you in this part of town. Whatever. I had a friend who was ordained to a parish in the north of Montreal when I was teaching in Montreal, and he discovered that there were some very dodgy nightclubs on a street in his patch where all kinds of very unpleasant things were going on. And so he started to pray and work to see how he could help the people who were being caught up with that. And there was a huge backlash, and a kind of he got sick for months, etc. All sorts of nasty things happened. I just mentioned that to say you never know when you're called to a particular area. You have to do the Jesus thing. You have to discern what it is that we are called to do in this place. And you have to have people around you praying for you and with you, because if you don't, you're you're vulnerable anyway, because being a Christian is being vulnerable. But being prayerful means that there is at least some protection. And to try to plant flags in Caesar's world which say that Jesus is Lord. And if that's in a world of mega money, then you have to plant the flags of communities which do money differently, whether it's in credit unions for the poor or whatever it is. And mutatis mutandis in all the other areas of life. You know, when people are deeply wounded and bruised and battered in their sexuality and their sexual expression, then actually having Christian families who are modeling what family life is like for a society that's all but forgotten in some quarters is just running a flag up a pole which says, oh, didn't know you could be like that. And people mock this and say, oh, this is just bourgeois, comfortable middle class. It isn't. It isn't. Look at how the early church developed. Look at the households in the early church and how that worked. And so there are many, many ways, and I couldn't possibly predict. I could tell you a little bit about some of the cities that I've worked in, and it's different each time. They have their own dynamics. One of the things I used to do was, it was great fun, would get myself invited to go, for instance, there's a town at the south of my diocese called Darlington on the Durham-Yorkshire border. And one of the local clergy asked me to come and do a talk there on what would Darlington look like if God was in charge. And they invited the mayor and the council and the local elected civic representatives. They all came, they sat in the front row. They're a bit nervous as to what the bishop was going to say. And we had a wonderful evening discussing the kingdom of God and talking about how things could be different. And then realizing that God wants wise human authorities to run his world for him. Whether or not they honor him personally, he wants the world to be run. And come back to the Psalm 72 vision. That why do we honor the messianic vision in the Old Testament? Because the king hears the cry of the poor and looks after the needy, prioritizes those who are at the bottom of the pile. True Christ-shaped human authority goes straight for the places where the pain is in society and says, this is where we're going to do what we do, and everything else has to be reorganized. You hear what I'm saying. That's probably quite enough for the moment. Yeah, question over here.
You talked about the church as a sign and foretaste of Jesus Christ, the resurrection, the life that we share. And you mentioned briefly that that's, of course, not primarily the buildings in which we worship, but also what we do in our communities. I'd be interested to have you talk on the relationship of our physical spaces as part of our witness in relationship to our actions as our physical witness.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I've gradually come into that question over the last 20 or so years, because when I was growing up, I just took it for granted that the church was people, not buildings, and the buildings were kind of stuffy, dusty, smelly old places that one would go into because that's where you went into, but actually that wasn't where it was at. Now, in my reflective early old age or late middle age or whatever it is, I actually think very differently. I think that at least two things are going on. At least I see them as two things in my mind, and I suspect they join up somewhere, and I probably don't have good language for that. One is the aesthetic dimension, that God made a beautiful world and wants us to be creators of beauty, and that beauty points to the gospel, and that if you try and do the gospel without beauty, you're actually cutting off the branch on which you're trying to stand, because the gospel message is that God is making this world over again to be even more beautiful and powerful than it is. And if we do that by building boxes that look like, a disused factory or something, and saying this will do as our church building, then we're actually sending, that's fine. I have celebrated the Eucharist in all sorts of unlikely places, in back streets and odd rooms and on beaches and on mountainsides, and you can do church anywhere, but just like if you love fine, of course, we're in Northern California, everybody loves fine wines. If you love fine wines, you can drink your fine wine out of a styrofoam cup if you like, it's the same wine, but you may find that it tastes even better if you put it in the proper sort of glass. And in the same way, you can do church absolutely anywhere, but to build a building which intentionally and prayerfully speaks as a building about literally the shape either of the cross or some other symbolism, then you're communicating at an imaginative level. And in the Western world, we've so often forgotten that imagination is a primary form and not just a secondary. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that buildings just do have memories. I do not know why, but that just is the case. When really bad things happen in buildings, they have really bad memories, and you have to deal with that in prayer and the various ways of dealing. When a building has been a place of joy and love and laughter and celebration and prayer for 4 years or for 400 years, it shows, and people come in and they sense. The first time I went to the island of Iona, it's off the coast of Scotland, where Columbus started the Scottish mission. You walk around the island, and the rocks and the stones all say to you, you might want to stop and say a prayer here. And there isn't a little notice saying this is a prayer place, because the whole place just does it to you. And maybe not everybody feels that, but a lot of people pick it up. So a church, both aesthetically and strangely, as a place where the very walls are saying this is a place of prayer, this matters. And as I say, if it all had to be demolished tomorrow, we would still do church. We would be in exile, be in the wilderness, we'd still do it. But God actually uses this stuff. Great question, thank you.
When we moved to this facility, we as a congregation committed to worship God in this building and not worship the building. It's been created in such a way that it is completely flexible. Everything can be removed fairly easily. And every month we host the homeless of Roseville in this facility. They sleep in this sanctuary. We drop the screens down, show them a movie, feed them a meal, have fellowship with them. Everyone is invited to participate in that, and I just wanted to let you know that.
Thank you very much. That's moving, and that is as it should be. And of course, in the Middle Ages, the nave of the church or the cathedral would regularly be a place which would be the community meeting place. And then the sanctuary in the sense of this area would be where they might say prayers, but the body of the church, which you might call the nave, was used as a community place. And we in the Western world have forgotten that. It's wonderful to hear that. Thank you so much.
Question, right?
Okay.
You mentioned in your talk that the church witnesses to the work of God in Christ through the costly work of reconciliation. I had the privilege of seeing you host and speak at the New Begin House inaugural lectures a few years back. What role does the visible unity of the church play in that work of reconciliation?
The visible unity of the church is the goal for which many of us continue to pray and many of us continue to work. Because as long as the church is visibly disunited, the world manages to take precious little notice of us. You know, that's why in our newspapers, at least in the UK, I don't know how it is with you, the newspapers absolutely love division in the church. There's all sorts of good things that can go on in the church which they never report. But if there's a little spat and a bishop and a parish priest fall out or whatever, that's all over the papers, because the subtext is, there you are, we're not going to listen to these Christians, they can't even agree among themselves. But if the Pope and the Archbishop, or the Archbishop and the leaders of the Methodist and Free Churches, if they actually get together and say something not bland and boring, but rather striking into the society, then people sit up and take notice. And that's, of course, when then you get the opposite reaction. There's this division, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God. You please keep on talking about God and don't try and tell us how to run the world. And of course, if we know our business as Christians, we ought to be the ones who are saying to the world, God is God, Jesus is Lord, this is how to be human, and you're messing it up. That's why they don't like us saying it. But if we can say that, and the visible unity doesn't have to be yet structural, in the sense that we don't have to figure out all the different ways in which you could have one grand hierarchical structure in which we would all somehow fit. That's probably the wrong idea. The visible unity happens when we link arms and go onto a rubbish housing estate with young people and we actually work to clean it up and sort it out. Or when we link arms and go and stand together in a rural parish where there's been terrible disasters because of farming diseases or whatever, and say, we are with you. This is the visible church acting in mission. And when the visible church acts in mission together, then the structural unity can or whatever, can do what it likes in due course. Let's do mission together, let's do Bible study together, and then all sorts of things can happen. If we wait for the committees to sort it out, we'll wait forever.
Yeah, I think we'll have two more questions. One of them must be from a woman, because I had men questioning. Please. Yeah, thank you.
Very short question. Are you saying that in verse 7 of Romans 16, greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow kinsmen? I just have the ESV translation here and don't know the Greek. Is that common scholarship, or is this your understanding is that she really is a woman apostle? When you just tossed that off, I was just like,
yeah. There's
whoa.
been a huge debate about this in the last 20 years. There have been whole books written about this lady called Junia, and some texts had made her Junias, as though she was a man.
Yes, that's true.
But there is no male name known as Junias. That will be very
Elton
odd.
Epp did the
Yeah,
scholarship
that's
on this,
right.
and his book, Junia, the First Apostle, is worth reading.
Elton J. Epp.
Elton J.
Great textual scholar, wrote a book on it. But there's been lots of learned articles and so on, and I think it's fair to say that the consensus now, right across the board, is that A, she is a woman, and B, she is an apostle. And I mean, I see Paul's meaning of apostle quite simply in the line of, say, 1 Corinthians 9:1 and so on, that an apostle is somebody who was a witness of the risen Lord Jesus. And of course, there were women there as well. And so if that's the definition of an apostle, then come on, let's have it. And in the Roman Catholic tradition, Mary Magdalene, the first one at the tomb, the first one to tell anyone else that Jesus is alive, she is seen as the apostle to the apostles. And that's why, I mean, just to follow that up, I've often said to people, if you're going to argue about women's ministry, which of course we in the Church of England have been doing for years and years and years, I always start with John 20. So when Jesus wants to call somebody to tell other people that he has been raised and is ascending, he doesn't call Peter or James or John. He doesn't even call Paul of Tarsus early. He calls Mary Magdalene. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And since all Christian ministry flows from the announcement that the crucified Jesus has been raised from the dead, she's the start of it.
One more?
There's one on the front here.
Let's go here. Well, off the back of that, we're in a generation of pluralism is a growing paradigm, a growing reality for all of us, our grandkids, ourselves. I read in your preface to your latest book on Paul that Peter inspired a chapter 4, if I read that correctly, and I confirmed with you earlier that he did. So this is a great opportunity to, that chapter is on religion. Religion in Paul's day. Could you comment on that, on how we can scaffold Paul and your two work together with that rising pluralism we're facing?
Yes, thank you for that.
Inspired was not
yes.
the word you used, it was nudged.
I don't, nudged,
Yes,
was
yes,
it? Okay.
yeah.
Well, nudged is a soft English way of saying inspired. So it must be 3 years ago, I shared with Peter the early shape of my book on Paul and the early chapters, the historical context. I had one on Paul's philosophical, one on Paul's Jewish world, one on Paul's Greek philosophical world, one on his Roman imperial world. And Peter basically said, what about the religious world? Well, I was going to deal with the religion sort of on the way with those, but I went home and thought about it, and I thought, actually, he's right. Thank you. This is how scholarship ought to work, by the way, collaboratively.
Yes, exactly.
So chapter 4 of that book, and then chapter 13 towards the end, where I come back to the same set of themes, was about the religious world of Paul's day. And yes, we in the modern West have been rather shocked in the last generation that our world has become more pluralistic. But actually, that's exactly as it was in the first century. The first century was the most amazing smorgasbord of different religious, philosophical, cultural options. And somebody like Saul of Tarsus, going right the way around the northern side of the Mediterranean, he'd seen it all. And religions coming from the east, from Egypt, from Persia, etc., the new military religions like Mithraism from Rome and the West, plus all the traditional ones and the local cults, they were all out there. And so learning how to navigate that world was one of the basic early Christian things you had to do. And so when we find ourselves in a plural world today, learning how to navigate our plural world, actually the New Testament is right there with us. And it's in some ways much more relevant now that we're in this world than when we could fool ourselves in the sort of old Christendom West vision that actually our world was basically Christian with a few bells and whistles on the edge. So I think it's a great opportunity, but it means that a lot of us who learned how to read the Bible with those old assumptions have got to read it quite differently, recognizing what the social, cultural, political, religious context really was. And so we can see Paul, particularly in a letter like 1 Corinthians, but actually it's on the edge of all sorts of things, negotiating and navigating. And he doesn't say, and this is the point of Philippians 4, which I quoted before, he doesn't say that everything out there is bad and dark and we have to retreat in here, because he's a creational theologian. He believes that this is God's good world, and that however corrupt and dehumanizing this or that religion may be, it wouldn't have the power it does if it didn't reflect at least a little speck of something in God's good creation. Hence, the altar to the unknown God, and hence, as some of your own poets have said, and we need to acquire the kind of savvy knack of being able to read today's culture, and not just the official religions, but in the movies and the television and the novels and the plays and so on, and be able to discern what's going on and be able to see whether are altars to the unknown God that we can interpret, and where there are shrines to pagan gods that we need to say, no, actually not that way.
Thank you. Now, I think we'll stop there. That has been a great conversation. It's a good place to stop. It gives us lots of work to do. And thank you very much.